Oh, so many crowd questions.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to Left Bank Books presents Jenna Tang, the translator of Fang First Love Paradise by Lin Yihan. Jenna will be in conversation tonight with debut St. Louis author Kat Tang, so thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. So when you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it keeps our streets paved and our libraries open and all the other amazing things that make St. Louis great. It also allows us to get authors the support they deserve by hosting events such as this. Okay. So thank you all so much for joining us. We also want to extend a welcome to our virtual audience. Thank you for joining us from afar. You'll be able to participate in the event as well by leaving your question for the question and answer as a YouTube comment. So thank you very much for being here. So for tonight's event, tonight we are delighted to introduce Jenna Tang, a Taiwanese writer and a literary translator who translates between Chinese, French, Spanish, and English. She graduated with her MFA in fiction creative writing from the New School in New York City. Her translations and essays are published in the Paris Review, Restless Books, Latin American Literature Today, AAWW, McSweeney's Catapult, and more. Her interviews can be found at World Literature Today and Words Without Borders. Jenna was the 2021 mentee at ALTA Emerging Translators Mentorship Program with a focus on Taiwanese prose. Jenna is currently based in Taiwan. Also joining us tonight is St. Louis's own Kat Tang. Kat is a graduate of Columbia's MFA program, where she taught as an undergraduate writing fellow. Born in China, later relocated to Japan and raised in California, she is fascinated by how we make and fake human connection in a technologically evolving world. Her short stories and graphic narratives have appeared in Electric Literature, The Margins, Pigeon Pages, and elsewhere. Kat's debut novel is titled 5-Star Stranger. It is currently available for pre-order, so we can help you with that after the event at the desk. It will be released in August. We are very excited to have Kat back for an event with us as well at that point. So keep an eye out for that on our social media page. We'll have more information. And today we are recognizing the book Fang First Love Paradise, written by Lin Yihan. Yihan was a Taiwanese writer whose first and only novel, Fang First Love Paradise, sold over 1 million copies globally and won prizes including the Open Book Best Fiction Award and the Liang Yu-sen Literary Award. The novel became a feminist manifesto across Asia and was dubbed one of the most influential books of Taiwan's Me Too movement. It is a heartbreaking account of sexual violence and a remarkable reinvention of the trauma plot, turning the traditional narratives upside down to explore women's vulnerability, victimization, and the lengths people will go to survive. So here to discuss this book, translation, and many more topics tonight, please join me in welcoming Jenna Tang and Kat Tang.
Hey everyone, so I think we're just going to start off with you reading a passage from the book, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kat. And I'll start reading from the very beginning of the novel, just for you to experience a little bit of the flavor of the book. Part 1, Paradise. Lolita knew the best thing about being a child was that nobody would take her words seriously. She could boast, break her promises, even lie. The things that come out of a child's mouth are often shiny, naked truths. Reacting instinctively out of self-defense, most adults might reassure themselves, what do kids even know? Out of frustration, children learn to tell the truth selectively. This freedom of self-expression is what allows them to grow up. The only time Lolita ever got scolded for something she had said was at a restaurant in a high-rise hotel. These tedious adult gatherings always came with rare, uninteresting delicacies. At this particular meal, a sea cucumber lay on a big porcelain plate like a long turd deep in a toilet that the maid had scrubbed to a brilliant shine. Lolita let the sea cucumber slide in and out of her mouth, and then spit it back on the plate. Soon she was giggling audibly. Her mother asked what was so funny. It's a secret, she replied. When her mother raised her voice and asked again, Lolita said, it's like giving a blowjob. Infuriated, her mother made her stand up to the side as punishment. When Fancy said she wanted to stand next to her friend, Mamadou softened her tone and turned to exchange pleasantries with Mama Fang. Lolita knew that compliments like, what a well-mannered child your daughter is, were just empty praise. Their families live in the same apartment building on the same floor. Eating often knocked on the Fang family's door in her pajamas and slippers. And no matter what she had in her hands, be it fast food or workbooks, Mama Fang always welcomed her. They often joked that eating was like a long-lost daughter. The girls could while away a whole night with just a piece of tissue. They were on the cusp of turning into grown adults, but they never had to hide their stuffed animals from each other. They didn't have to pretend that the only games they cared for anymore were poker and chess. Eating and Sichi stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Sichi mouthed, "Why did you even say that?" Eating silently replied, "It just sounded smarter than saying it looked like poop." It would take Liu Eating many years to understand that using a word he barely understood was absolutely criminal. It was like saying "I love you" to someone you don't love at all. Sichi pursed her lips, gestured at the boats below, and remarked about how many there were. They were about to return to Kaohsiung port. Each of the whale-like cargo ships was led by a tiny trim of the boats. Various big and small boats aligned with each other, squeezing out V-shaped waves. The whole of Kaohsiung port resembled a blue blouse being ironed, smoothed over back and forth. The view made them feel sentimental and sad. They were soulmates who shared the infinite beauty of existence with one another. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Listening to you read it, I realized that there's so much foreshadowing in the very opening that, comes back around at the end. But what I wanted to talk to you about first is actually, is the language that comes across in this book. It's very heavy with metaphors, some funny, as you just read, and others, deeply poignant, sad, angry, a lot of different types of metaphors. And so I noticed while I was reading that a lot of these are not so common in English. So I have one written down here from page 40. Her long neck supported her egg-like face. From her forehead was as full as a burp from a satisfied baby, which I just love that, it's so visceral. So what was your experience like translating these, sort of unfamiliar metaphors into English?
That's a great question, and thank you for noticing that. I struggled so much when I was translating it. I remember talking to my editor and was like, it was as full as a baby's burp. And so those places, I feel like there's also threads of surreal and strange that's going into those metaphors, where image and any kinds of projection, like the author is trying to make us see as readers. So there were those places that kept coming back and was like, what is she trying to say? And those moments were challenging, partly also because the author is no longer here with us. So it's hard for me to really know what exactly she was trying to say.
So normally, as a translator, would you be in conversation with the author, kind of asking them what their intention was and trying to find the best equivalent in English, or are you kind of creating new metaphors together?
Depending on the context, so sometimes there are equivalents in English. In those moments, I would consult my editor or peers who are also translators in the US, anyone I know who translates into English. But there are also moments when I would ask other Chinese-speaking friends and ask them, what was your read? What was your perspective? And I kind of gather all the perspectives that make sense to me, and then think about what is the best way that I can present this in a translation.
Do you have a favorite one or one that was particularly challenging that you remember?
Yeah, I do remember there was a part when they talk about the language sounds crispy, like munching on a cabbage. And when they talked about that part, they rhymed in Chinese. And so I was really trying to rhyme it in English, which I eventually did. I hope that was noticeable.
Do you remember the Chinese, can we hear what that rhyme sounded like? If you remember, if you don't remember.
I don't really remember, but that was at the beginning part. And I talked about that with my editor as well. And I remember we were just really working into the language and was like, how do we make it rhyme better? And that was those were some moments of kind of making poetry into the language of this book.
So selfishly, I do have one that I was confused about that I want to ask you about. It's on page 163, when Mr. Mao Mao sees the woman that he loves enter his shop with her husband in order to pick out a present for their baby. And it says that the expression on his face is like the basket of mint candies that anyone could take from the front of a barbecue restaurant. And it just seemed very specific, and I wasn't sure what it meant for a face to look like a basket of mint candies in front of a barbecue restaurant.
It's actually just like a face of whatever.
Oh.
But I knew it was like very lengthy and there's like so many twists and turns into the language. But I thought that was like strange when I was reading it, and I kind of just wanted to keep that strangeness throughout. And I love how detailed you've read and like how they left impressions with you as a reader.
Yeah, so a lot of these metaphors are not like common in Chinese either.
No, not really. There's always layers, and sometimes I'm just like, what do you think on a daily basis? To come up with all these metaphors and images, and that was part of the process that makes it interesting for me, especially.
Yeah, definitely. Another theme that comes up a lot in the book is literature. A lot of the characters in this novel are very well read, and it seems like the author herself was also very well read. As I was getting towards the middle, I really felt like I was reading like a reverse, or not a reverse Lolita, but like a Lolita from Dolores's perspective. So did you find yourself looking up or reading into works that were referenced? How well read are you compared to the? I'm just kidding. You don't have to that.
Yeah, I used to read a lot of classical Chinese literature, and we had to read in the classical language that sometimes I need a little bit of translation just within the Chinese language itself. It's not exactly equivalent, but it's a little bit like in English we read from Shakespeare. So I did a lot of research of the original meaning of all these quoted texts or the origins that I noticed like it might be a little incorporated into the daily language of the book itself. So I did that, and also I often have to ask myself, like, is there more subtext, or is there something else that might go into the text that fits the book's logic? And that's the most difficult part.
So did you kind of have references as you were going along, just double checking those things?
Yeah, it gave me a bit of OCD symptoms, and be like, is this really what it means, and what about something else? And I wanted to make sure it's seamless. I did my best, and there's just a lot of research of going online and be like, this poem that she quoted, or this part of the passage sounds like some poem over here, and is she intentionally misusing some classical references? Like sometimes she did, and she like twisted the meaning, sometimes for ironies and sometimes for other things.
Wow, yeah, that's really intense. So in the novel, the kind of antagonist or the rapist, I guess, he teaches Chinese literature. And so at points he's described as very eloquent, but other times kind of clumsy and cliched with language. I think on page 209, Siqi says, nobody chose their words better than him, and there was no word that sounded more off than his. And so how do you translate the language of someone who's at once supposed to be poetic, but also kind of corny and also malicious?
I think I got a lot of inspirations from other books I read. Sometimes I've just been reading throughout the time I was translating this book. So sometimes I was informed by different characters, where sometimes I watch movies and I try to bring the voices that might be a little close to the characters into my translation. And I love this question because at the same time, like the voices of these girls like Fang, Lolita, and Xu Wen are actually voices I imagined in my head from my childhood friends who live in the same apartment building and so on and so forth. So I try to reimagine, because they're no longer in my life, and I try to imagine what it was like when they were speaking, and what it was like for these voices to intersect with each other when they're sharing this closeness and bond.
Also, you knew people who were living in the actual apartment complex?
Not really, it's just my apartment.
Oh, got it. got it. So what, I'm curious what movie character or, that you were imagining for teacher lead.
For teacher lead, it's a mix of a lot of, I also looked into Lolita, the Humbert voice, and I also looked at other films that are about sexual violence. I read a bunch of different narratives that talks about sexual violence, like Chanel Miller's memoir, and also The Black Box from Sherry Ito, and also Kim Ji-young 1982. And I was trying to find, most of the time we find more like the victim's voices, but then I would also take into account like what are the voices like in the victim's head when the narratives were flowed out. So it's a mix of a lot of things, like not necessarily from one character specifically, but I do take into account like when I watch movies in general, just like how are the villains talking, but what type of villains they are.
Yeah, it makes them more multidimensional than just pure evil, like how they justify these actions to themselves. So I was also struck by the line on page 233. She suddenly realized that it wasn't the fault of people who learned literature, rather literature itself let them down. And it's kind of a bold statement to make in a book, you're just saying like literature lets people down, but here you are, reading a book. So what did you make of that sentiment, and did it inform you as you were working on the translation?
Yeah, I think from the book's context, maybe we're talking about the sexual grooming experience itself is a reflection of that, because Fang Xiqi's character, she's so into language and literature that, and at the same time, she was sexually groomed because Li Guohua is so well versed in all these literary texts and the things that she loved, the language. So in a way, she was emotionally controlled at a young age by this teacher, and so I think the fact that she wasn't able to get herself out of it, and there are so many complications and factors that play into it, and one of it is her being in love with literature, and she couldn't parse like the complications of her love for literature, and like what is that connection with like that love for teacher, like all this is part of like the sexual grooming itself, and I feel like it's also part of it that she's like manifesting that sentiment.
There's a lot of violence of different kinds in this book. And so on page 157, Siqi imagines a movie of her experiences with teacher, and that it would actually be quite dull as the repeated acts of violence occur over and over again. And so I imagine that it was difficult for you to translate all of these scenes, this kind of repetition of this violence. So what was your strategy while tackling that aspect of the project?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked that up because this is a part I really struggled. Because the doll, like, it also refers to the corpse of the baby. And that somehow projected the other, it's no spoiler, but it's also projecting the other character Ewan's miscarriage later on. So there's a lot of, like, it's also coming from classical reference of the image itself, like coming from like the Chinese expressions. So I struggled a lot because it was also a very disturbing scene. And I didn't try to tone it down because I feel like that's what she was trying to say here. So there's a lot of that. And there are many moments that's talking about Siqi, the protagonist, like spending time with her perpetrator, teacher Li. That felt really claustrophobic when I was translating it, because when I'm translating it, it sort of became some kind of embodied experience that I could imagine. There's so many senses to being described in the novel that I feel like I was literally there. And I could smell the things that the narrator described, and I could really like feel that I was also there being trapped.
Yeah, so how do you take care of your own mental well-being while, working on a very important project, obviously, but very difficult as well?
It's community, and also just the consciousness knowing that I have to stop at one point of the day and do something else, like cooking or just doing something entirely different and distract myself and not, like spending that amount of time in the same project. Like I know I have to like drop it at one point in like within a week or within a day.
And so when you were translating, did you also ever have sort of an unexpected feeling that arose, not necessarily dullness, but just something that you didn't expect?
Yeah, a lot. It reminds me of so many childhood friends who disappeared because of sexual violence or other complications like happening in the family. In this book, the reason I translated it is partly like in memory of them. They are probably still somewhere in this world, except they chose to maybe be in a different identity, or they chose to be somewhere else. So I hope one day they'll see it and they're okay. So that's a sentiment like I didn't expect. I would think back on because those are memories from a long time ago, and I sort of buried them at the back of my mind.
So this ended up being a lot more personal than maybe you were expecting when you first took it on.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of personal, so I know that you are you currently living in Taiwan, or you're in New York, but sort of back and forth? Or?
Yeah, I'm kind of between New York and Taiwan, but I do spend like a sufficient amount of time in Taiwan.
Yeah, so Taiwan is obviously a very unique place, history all of its own, and so she thinks to herself that the types of traditions Taiwan had were those left by colonization, shifts in language, even in names. You know, people had to take, was it like Japanese names at some point? Yeah. And so she sees sort of her own loss of self reflected in her homeland. And so how do you think that, like, since you have experiences with Taiwan as well, like how did that inform your translation of this work? Did you ever feel maybe that you could be too close to it and not explain for someone who's not Taiwanese some sort of reference? Or did you feel like you gained a new experience of Taiwan for yourself through translating this?
Yeah, I'm always an advocate for Taiwanese literature, and there are so many things like Li Han used to say when she was still alive that I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I thought. So translating this book is another step for me to like introduce more iconic titles that I really like in Taiwan to English-speaking audiences. There's so many things like it is too close to me because every single place that appeared in this novel appeared in my life too. Like the Malcolm Gondola that appeared in some parts of the scene, and a lot of these places, some of them unnamed, but I sort of just know like which Starbucks it is or which coffee shop it is, which library. Like I roughly maybe know, I could be wrong, but there are just so many places that were part of my life too. So that sort of informed me that it could have happened to me too, except I lived a different life, and sometimes I feel like I was so luxurious to be okay sometimes. Like there's some kind of guilt in there when I was translating it, the book.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, kind of speaking about the sort of the movement that it spurred with the Me Too movement. How do you hope that like English language audiences will respond to that aspect? Because it was such a big deal in Taiwan, this book. How do you think like people will connect to it here? Or how do you hope they will?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I really hope more Taiwanese titles are being translated into English because so far it's probably like we can count it. There's not enough titles that's being brought to English-speaking audiences. And at the same time, I'm just curious, like, what other narratives this book might connect to. There are a lot of people who share their stories with me as readers, private or in public, and I really appreciate all of them. And I just feel like Me Too narratives and Me Too titles, they're somehow like, even though they're so different in its own sense, but somehow like there's something that connects all of them together. And I hope that by bringing this title, it would also help building many kinds and like kind of multi-dimensional connections.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch upon the emotional aspects of the book. How do you, when you're translating or, you know, when you're thinking about which words to use, how to guide a reader's emotions, what is that thought process like as you're trying to choose, you know, between like a Latinate word or a Germanic or whatever it is, you know, like when you're trying to choose which word to use?
Yeah, I actually keep a playlist to keep the emotional landscape or moods that I would feel while I was translating. And I would just listen to that list in actually various languages to keep that mood. Sometimes it gets a little too much and I have to like take a pause. But some of the things I really love is that Li Han or the narrator Fang, she repeatedly said, I was reading translated literature, and I thought that was interesting because like in Taiwan there is a culture of reading more translated literature than literature from local authors. It's both, but there's definitely that trend, and I love that she's bringing that aspect of the culture to the book as well.
And so how did you come across this book and what drove you to decide that you wanted to translate it?
Yeah, I read about the book when it first came out in 2017, and I was on a train from Lyon to Paris, and I was studying translation there at the time. And so it was close to my time, like moving back to Taiwan after a year. So I was just browsing through catalogs and like the newest books in Taiwan, and this book caught my attention. And after I went back to Taiwan, finished reading it, I was like there's so many concepts about gender and about sexual violence and the sensitivity of it that were contained in the book. So I've just been remembering this book, and I went to MFA program in New York and did my own writing, and I was taking part in Bruno Donatello's translation workshop. And in that workshop, we sort of just had to find projects, and this book just like came back to my mind, and I was like, why don't I try to translate this book? And I was confident in the reference, the classical reference language inside the book, that I was like, maybe I can do this. So I started translating, and then it became an obsession, and I just like decided not to sleep, and translated in a row for 3 months.
Oh yeah, so how long did it take you to do the translation?
The first draft was 3 months.
Oh, wow.
Because I literally didn't sleep for many nights. And I just couldn't stop because I feel like if I drop it, I would just become so lazy that I would no longer do it. So I just did it in one breath. And after that, it was more like editing and having this project take part in like the translation mentorship program. And then just like gradually moving it to pitching and now the publication of the book.
Yeah, I am interested in the process. I don't know if anyone in the audience is like wants to translate or is already a translator and wants to get some book in their native language or whatever language they know out there. If you could just talk a little bit about how that process works. Like, do you kind of have a fully translated book and then you pitch it?
Yeah, so I did have a fully translated book when I pitched it, but I totally recommend people do not do that. And a lot of more senior and experienced translators would say the same thing, because normally we just need about 20 to 25 double-spaced pages of samples to be submitted in terms of literary translation. So I did so just because of my obsession. So I had a full draft, but of course I was being advised not to present the whole book to the publisher, but more like a limited amount of pages. So during my mentorship, I was working with translator of Stories of the Sahara, Mike Fu, and he guided me through many process about pitching and getting to know editors of lit mags or other publishers. So during that time, with also the help of many other translators in the community, I pitched the book to over 30 publishers. It was a lot, and it was a lot of waiting, and it was also a lot of gathering context, background of the author and the book in Taiwan to be able to present them to all these editors and publishers. And eventually I met my editor now in a Alta pitch session. It's an annual conference from the American Literary Translators Association. So we met there during like the 7-8 minute pitch session, and I sort of just mentioned this project to her, and she was like, oh yeah, let me take a look. And then a year after, she acquired the book.
So I know you speak a lot of languages. You can tell everyone and they'll be very impressed, but does your knowledge of other languages also help you when you're doing translation of a specific language? And if you have any like examples, I think I'd be super interested to hear that.
Yeah, there are different layers or different ways. So when it comes, because in this book they mentioned so many different like international titles. For example, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book. And so when I translated it, I would put all these accents into the titles or the names, and I feel like, oh, that was important. So little details like that. But also in other ways, like because I also enjoy reading books from other languages, not just Mandarin Chinese and English. I also read a lot from Spanish. And so in Spanish, I would find all these, I enjoy reading like poetry and also experimental narratives. So I would read from them and be like, oh, is that a voice that may be close to some of my characters? Like, can I be informed from these characters, from these voices? So all these voices, like sometimes like things pop out in Spanish when I was translating and kind of messes me around. But I find it really helpful to be able to read narratives from so many languages and to be able to have resources to inform myself in the process of translation.
How are we doing on time?
We're good.
Yeah. Okay, so before we turn it over to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask, are you working on any other projects currently, translations or your own work?
Yeah, I'm working on another short story collection in translation, also from a feminist writer from Taiwan, called Liu Zhi. And the literal translation of her title is like Goddess's Cafeteria, but there's like more context to it. It's just currently temporarily titled. But it's also about like sexual harassment, sexual aggression on a daily basis in a Taiwanese daily life, like in subway and yoga class, and so many more. Like a lot of those stories, like some of them like incorporated mythologies, local beliefs and so on, and it's pretty interesting. And there's a small chapbook coming out this year from my translation of Liu Zhi's story from Stranger's Past. So that's my next project, and I'm really excited. But it's also great to have worked with authors whose works are kind of in some kind of conversation.
And can you repeat the name of the short story collection again?
In Chinese, it's called 女神自助餐, and it sounds, the literal translation is like Goddess's Cafeteria. It's kind of having the concept of serve yourself. But there's more to that, and we're still like discussing how it should be translated. Yeah.
Great. Well, how do we want to do the Q&A?
We don't have any in the basket here.
Are there any audience questions here?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Should we write?
Yeah, should we write it or should we pass it?
We can. Okay, well, I'll just pass the next time. Did you have one?
Yeah, sure. Can you speak to the specific challenges of translating Taiwanese literature? Because I know language in Taiwan is itself very complicated with both Mandarin as well as Hokkien and Hakka languages. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, of course. I grew up in multilingual family, so my paternal family speaks Hakka and my maternal family speaks Hokkien. And so sometimes when I wasn't too sure about like some words, I would just like ask family members. And a lot of Taiwanese titles for a language is really slangy. So I constantly have to like be up to date about the languages that just came out last year or this year, this month. And we've actually checked out a lot of Taiwanese things together one time, and yeah, so it's a lot of research and also thinking about is how important it is to show that this is from another dialect, or how important to show that this may certain words or sentences may come from different language influences all from Taiwan. And Taiwanese titles in general is just not being translated enough. There are just so many titles out there that we're searching for translators, and there's like still a lot that we can do.
I was curious if you could share more just what your process looked like in working with the author of the book.
Yeah, the author's deceased, so I couldn't consult anything from her, and nor can I consult anything of this estate because they're still going through trauma. So I did respect that space, and like I actually just never asked them. But mostly I was working with my translator peers or mentors and see how they read the book differently, and just kind of gather different perspectives and see how it works. And of course, there are also other discussions with my current editor and other working partners on the translation.
From knowing one author in the room, I feel like writing is such an intimate process. How do you ensure when translating, you're conveying the author's original intent in the words?
Yeah, it's a lot of asking myself questions, and sometimes not just working with the translators community, I also kind of just like not just asking the translators community, but I also like ask myself if I write, like what would I think? Because I'm trying to put myself in the author's shoe. But of course, it might not be accurate. I could be wrong in some things. But I was simply like trying my best with my own interpretation.
Any other questions? Keeping an eye on the online audience as well. Well, thank you so much. Let's thank both of our guests for joining us tonight. And thank you all so much for being here. If you haven't picked up your copies of the book yet, we've got them at the front desk. We also have Kat's upcoming book available for pre-order, so you can get that through the desk as well. We'll move some chairs and things, and we'll get some books signed in this corner. So thank you all so much for coming tonight.